And so I'm very pleased to introduce this panel. I'm Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I'm the director of the Kent Global Leadership Program on conflict resolution. And we thought it would be very important to have a focus on Sri Lanka. Everybody talks only about Ukraine, but there are other issues in the world. And I'm very grateful to Michael Paramatasan for having helped put together a really stellar panel. And I'm also grateful to my colleague at Columbia, Paige Fortna, for being the moderator today for that panel. So around this virtual table, we have Paige Fortna, the moderator, who is the Howard Brown Professor of U.S. Foreign and Security Policy, and has written very important books on peacekeeping and on peace agreements, ceasefire agreements. We have Shanta Devarajan, well known to many of you, who is now at Georgetown, but who worked for many years at the World Bank and was very much involved on the issues of the economy of Sri Lanka. We have Sonali Deranyagala. She is a lecturer at SOAS, but also a research scholar and a professor at SIPA. So I'm glad to have you with us. We have Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, who is the founding executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, a member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Group and of the board of the Lakshman Kadirgamar Institute for International and Strategic Studies. Thank you for joining us. And I know that for all of you, we have a panel that really is in very different time zones. So very good that we could put all of you together. And we have Kasturi Chellaraja Wilson, who is the CEO of Hemas Holdings, and who will give us also a private sector perspective on Sri Lanka. I won't be able to stay with you for the whole panel. I will watch the recording later because a meeting was thrown on me and I have to attend it. But I'm going to leave this panel in the able hands of Paige Fortna, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be a very important discussion. I think it's essential that not only the Columbia community, but all those who are watching this meeting on Zoom have a good awareness of what's going on in Sri Lanka and what can be done. So over to you, Paige.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here in very odd time zones for some of you, and especially to Michael for helping to put this together, and also for Olivia, who helped on the Saltzman side to put this together. And for those of you in the audience, we can't see you, but you can see us. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and Olivia will be keeping an eye on those. And when we get to the Q&A portion of this morning's session, or this afternoon session, or this evening session, depending on where you're tuning in from, Olivia will read the questions for our panelists. So I thought that we would just start with each of the panelists giving us just a few minutes of an overview of what has happened. I'll say, as somebody who I spent 9 months in Sri Lanka in 2018, 2019, so I've been following Sri Lanka in the news, but even as somebody who's quite interested in Sri Lanka, the Western news there was quite a lot of attention to the Sri Lanka crisis during the summer, but it has really fallen out of the news here. So it would be great to hear a little bit of an update from those of you who are more intimately involved with what's going on in Sri Lanka to kind of get our audience up to speed of what is still happening in a very important political and economic situation. So we didn't discuss what order we would go in, but why don't we start with you, Shanta, and then we'll just touch on each of the panelists, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Go ahead, Shanta.
Okay, thanks very much. It's very nice to be here and nice to be with old friends as well. The main point I want to make is that the current economic crisis in Sri Lanka is entirely due to misguided and I would say reckless policies by Sri Lankan policymakers. It is not due to COVID or the Ukraine war. Those might have exacerbated the crisis. But if you think about it, you know, the current crisis, the short-term crisis, started in 2019 when the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, they cut taxes from 15, the value-added tax rate went from 15% to 8%. And as a result, tax revenues practically disappeared. The deficit went through the roof. And Sri Lanka was essentially cut off from capital markets by March of 2020. So that was even before the COVID crisis really took off. They were already in big trouble. Now, the misguided part of it was that usually a country that gets into that situation goes for an IMF program and goes for a debt restructuring. And the central bank and the finance ministry refused to do both of those things. They steadfastly refused for 2 years. Now, during that time, all of these debt service payments were coming due, which they paid out of reserves. So they depleted their reserves down to zero. By February 2022, this year, they were practically disappeared. Worse than that, they financed that fiscal deficit, since they couldn't borrow, by borrowing from the central bank, which, as we know from the textbooks, will just lead to inflation. And so not surprisingly, Sri Lanka now has 70% inflation. So this was a colossal mistake and misguided policies. And that's what got us into trouble. Now, what's really interesting is you don't have to listen to me as an economist to say this. There arose a movement starting around February of this year called the Aragalaya movement, the People's Struggle, which is an unprecedented movement in Sri Lanka of people from all different ethnic groups and religions got together in protest. And they said the same thing that I just said. They put the blame on the current economic situation on the Rajapaksa administration. Their slogan was "Go home, Gota," which is to get rid of the president. But I want to also point out that they said 3 other things that are extremely important for the program going forward. They called on accountability of the government. That was their rallying cry. In fact, I remember seeing a poster that said something like, people should not be afraid of the government. The government should be afraid of the people. And that's exactly right. The second thing is they called for empowerment of the poor. And the third is they called for an end to elite capture. Now, these 3 things are what actually has been debilitating Sri Lankan economy for generations. This goes back to policies instituted in the 1950s. So even if we get out of the current crisis, and I think we will, since I'm supposed to be working on that at the moment, I really think we have to address these 3 fundamental issues of accountability, empowerment of the poor, and elimination of elite capture if we want the country to actually grow and flourish.
Thank you so much, Shanta. Let's turn to Sonali next.
Thank you. And very nice to be part of this panel too. I completely agree with what Shanta said. And in the summer, there was a lot of global attention on Sri Lanka with the Aragalaya movement and the protests and the Occupy swimming pool and all of that we had in Colombo. But I think we also have now quiet crisis going on, a crisis of poverty that we should really kind of focus on a little. And the World Bank recently, brought out their estimates of poverty in Sri Lanka. And in 1 year, that's 2021 to 2022, the rate of absolute poverty has doubled, and which I think is pretty staggering in 1 year to have a doubling of the poverty rate, gone from, that is, absolute poverty, $3.7 something a day, person per parity, gone from 13% to like nearly 26% in 1 year. And to put that in some kind of perspective, during COVID, the poverty rate went up by 1%. So, I mean, that's much more of a global story. Whereas here, due to reckless policy and all of that, we've had a doubling of the absolute poverty rate. And the repercussions of this are, could be long-term. As Shanta says, we hope we come out of this, and we haven't come out of this, but these poverty rates are going to be sustained over the next 5 years, maybe 2 to 3 years or so. And the effects could be long-term in terms of, do people fall into poverty traps? What's going to happen to human development? Already the World Food Programme, and again, their survey estimates like 40% of people are food insecure or are undernourished. I mean, that's huge for a country like Sri Lanka, which has had quite, pretty good welfare indicators up to now. So I think there is this quiet economic crisis going on. At the moment, we have an economy that's kind of being held together. It's, at a very low level equilibrium kind of thing. It's been held together, demand suppression and all of that. And in the midst of that, there is a staggering huge number of people who are economically extremely deprived. So to start off with that.
Thanks so much, Sonali. Let's turn to Sara next.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think what we need to understand is that what we have in Sri Lanka is basically a crisis of governance. We are suffering from a crisis of governance which did not begin with the Rajapaksas, but with the Rajapaksa capture of the state. It descended to a brand new low. And we are now trying to cope with the consequences of that. And I agree with Shanta. But I want to focus on the current situation whereby now Gotabaya Rajapaksa is out of power. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was a former prime minister, who was a member of parliament, not directly elected, but nevertheless, he took the prime minister's job, and then constitutionally, when Gotabaya resigned the presidency, he became the president. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe governs with Gotabaya Rajapaksa's majority in parliament. And therefore, his position on human rights in particular is very worrying. He has moved against the Aragalaya, the people's struggle. He has tried to divide them in saying there's a good Aragalaya and a bad Aragalaya. Yes, they burnt his house. They did all sorts of things like that. But if there is evidence, those people must be charged, brought before court, and the due process of law should be taken, should be allowed to take hold. But what has happened is that he seems to have decided on shock or tactics to quell any kind of dissent, open demonstrations of dissent, maybe because he wants to make out to the rest of the world that things in Sri Lanka are fine, and maybe he wants to be able to convince or placate his majority in parliament that really belongs to Gotabaya Rajapaksa, that he is a strong leader and that he will take charge. Now, I think the problem for Sri Lanka is this, is that assuming, and as Shanta says, hopefully we will get through this with regard to the IMF staff agreement coming through, we need a government that is not just legal, but it is also legitimate. What we have at the moment is a crisis of legitimacy. Ranil Wickremesinghe can talk about all sorts of far-reaching reforms, but the question will be asked of him, where is your mandate to implement them? And that is a big issue. And I think what we need is a clear timetable with regard to when we will go for a general election and when we will go for a presidential election, the constitutional stipulations notwithstanding. Furthermore, as he has said, and as I think we all agree, things may get worse before they get better. There are certain sacrifices that we have to make. We've had a culture of entitlement that has to break. We have to change our taxation system. We have to deal with the state-owned enterprises. We have to deal with a military budget, which eclipses the total amount spent on health and education. Now, in order for that, all of that to be done, you need a government who people will trust, and who they will have confidence in. You can't impose these things from high, up on high. You have to be able to talk and consult with people to be able to get their support. So that is the situation that we're in now. It seems to be somewhat in limbo, but we are certainly not out of the woods as yet. And as I said, things have every prospect of getting worse.
Thank you so much. Let's turn to Kasturi then.
Hi, so I'm not going to talk about policy, Shanta. All of them have given you quite a good backdrop of what's going on. So I'll try to say from a business side of it and how we see it. As Shanta said, the liquidity and solvency issues didn't pop up overnight. And we as a country actually just felt it aggravated with COVID. But as businesses, we felt it when the liquidity crisis came to a point that as businesses, we couldn't function. Even if you were an exporter, you had the problem, but Sri Lanka is reliant on domestic business, and a country which relies on domestic business quite a bit, with most of the businesses struggling to operate. You manage that, then you have the essentials like fuel, importing of all that, and the shortages rising up. Underpinning that was also a country and businesses who lived on subsidies. I mean, we lived on a fuel subsidy. I don't agree on it. We lived on power subsidies, and all these policy changes needed rectification. So you fast forward today, there is, with all the intervention of the experts and of course the governor who is taking a very firm stance, you feel a sense of stability. It's not good, but at least it's stable in terms of how a business could operate. We still operate under constraints where you have limited resources in whatever we want to do. However, there is a logic in how we can operate. But what does it mean? With inflation, we are operating in an environment at 70% inflation. It means you're translating those into costs. You're operating in an environment. 1 year ago, you were the currency was half the value, or at least it's today is half the value of what it was last year. And you're talking about interest rates at topping 30%, right? How do businesses manage, particularly SME businesses? And what's the fallout? SMEs are struggling, which means unemployment, which means more people going into poverty. So I think whatever policy changes you do, there has to be also change in governance, because it is not only a solvency or a solvency problem we are trying to solve. We need to change. It's a systemic change we need to be able to support the vulnerable as well as rectify the fundamentals in the economy. So that's my part from a business point of view.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think that that gives us a great overview with which to start. I did want to ask, again, because the Sri Lankan crisis was in the news so much in the West in the summer, and it has really fallen off. If any of you want to speak to particular developments that have taken place in the meantime that a Western audience should be aware of. And that's a kind of a question for any of you who want to chime in, either on the economic side, where things stand with the IMF, or on the political side. I understand that the Rajapaksas are back in the country; they're not back in power. Is there? I've been hearing a little bit about some protests around a few student leaders who were arrested, issues around the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Any updates that an audience? I assume our audience is largely in the West and Colombia students should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as far as the human rights situation is concerned, it's particularly bad because whilst the government promised a de facto moratorium to the Geneva Human Rights Council on the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, we've had these students who have been taken in, and we've had the president on more than one occasion making very strong speeches saying that, yes, you can have an argalaya, you can have a demonstration, but you must get permission from the police first, which is a bit absurd at one level, given what the motivations of the argalaya may well be. And he has very clearly indicated that he will brook no dissent as far as his stay in government is concerned. And it seems fairly clear now that he intends to stay for the remainder of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's term, you know. So I think a lot will depend, therefore, on as to whether we get the IMF staff agreement okayed, whether the Chinese will agree to whatever they have to, and we have to take it from there. But as I said, there is going to be a fair amount of privation that is going to be visited upon the population as a consequence of all our past misdeeds over the last 70 odd years.
Thank you. Shanta, did you want to jump in?
Just add to that. I mean, I'll fully agree with what
We're not
he
here.
just,
Oh, there you go. Now we can hear you.
yeah, I fully agree with what Sarah just said. On the economic front, it might seem like it has fallen off the radar screen because we don't see the long gas lines for petrol and so on. But that's illusory. There is no more gasoline in the country than there used to be. What they've done is come up with a system of rationing gasoline where you get a QR code and you get, what, 50 liters a month or something like that with your QR code, so that people don't have to stand in line to get gasoline. They go in with their QR code and get the gasoline. And so the amount of gasoline hasn't changed. People are still very much deprived. And as Kasturi was saying, businesses are really suffering from the shortages of gasoline and other imports. But somehow the president and the government seems to be taking credit. They say, well, we used to have gas lines before, but now in the new administration, there are no more gasoline lines. So this is all an illusion. The situation has not improved. And as Sarah says, it might even get worse before it gets better.
Great. Well, that's a good, unless Sonali or Kasturi wants to jump in, that's a good segue to my next question, which is really about whether Wickremesinghe's strategy, which, as you all have kind of laid out for us, has been to focus on the economy and maybe some illusory policies on the economy, but not on political reform. And so two questions about that. One, whether that will work politically, or whether, you know, it seems from an outsider's perspective that the protests at Argala could sort of reignite and push him out of power as the Rajapaksas were pushed out of power. Is that something that you see as likely, or is this a, you know, from Wickremesinghe's perspective, a fairly reasonable policy to try to hold on to power at least until the next elections? And then secondly, will this strategy work economically? Is this the right strategy to pull Sri Lanka out of the economic crisis? And again, this is a question for all of you. So if any of you want to jump in, Sarah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, in the short term, what he has done is to be able to change the narrative with regard to the Argala. He has now come to say that, look, the Argala is now really about these extremist elements who also functioned in 88, 89 when we had the JVP insurgency. And they are determined to grab power by the use of violence and all of that. Yeah. I think the middle classes who were part of the Argala at the outset have either bought it or have been placated by the, you know, disappearance of the queues for gasoline and all of that. But into the future, it's quite possible that if there is to be a spontaneous outpouring of dissent and demonstrations, it may well happen outside of Colombo, where people will not have enough food, enough medicine, and it'll be those basic needs which will lead to that outpouring. And in a sense, I mean, in that respect, Colombo may well be a bubble. And the fear is that it could turn into a haves versus have-nots kind of situation.
Thank you. Yes, Sonali, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I jump in. I think the budget, 2023 was presented a couple of weeks ago in Sri Lanka, and even the governor of the central bank seemed to say what Sarah is saying, that the level of poverty and the rise in poverty And if this is not addressed in the immediate term, that, you could have serious social unrest, and that'll make, the Argalia seem quite small in comparison. So it could be pretty serious going forward if this is not addressed seriously. And with, we talk about pain having to be shared equally. And I think Sri Lanka has to really think about, what does equal pain, what does this feel like? And it really has to be distributed amongst, all segments of society. We're talking about, of course, increasing taxation and so on, but that has to be implemented, and the increase in the net and all of that has to be done in order to share this pain equally. And the other point you asked whether, is there a choice, going forward, is this a correct strategy economically for Sri Lanka? In the short term, I don't think Sri Lanka has a choice. At this moment, we have to go to the IMF, and there has to be a short-term stabilization before, and then you can think of the long-term, what went wrong historically, and make the country more competitive vis-a-vis exports and productivity and all of this that needs to be done, but has always needed to be done. But in the short term, I think economically, there's not a lot of choice, but the choice is in really how you distribute the pain. And I think there, that is a choice, and we need to be, do that kind of very carefully.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Kasturi.
So for me, I mean, to add on to that, when you, touching on what Sonali says, when you try to distribute the pain equitably, that's where politics come into play. And even the taxes, the revenues you're increasing is on a few taxpayers, which is just 100,000 files. The rest of it, and the economy actually is not controlled by them. And the political will to do that won't be there. And whatever changes we see now, yes, I agree with Shanta, it's just the lack of cues. It's people just simply can't afford it anymore, and they're learning to manage within their means. But the level of struggle people have in terms of medicine, in terms of even education, I mean, we've got a data point. We are in the stationary and learning segment, and we potentially see 30% of the kids won't go back to school. That's because they can't afford the transport, B, they can't even afford a single meal. What does that do to the country as a whole? But economic reform without political reform, the reason I say that is while you do the fundamental changes you need to come through in the short term, long term, our economy is underpinned by few institutions, and those are politically influenced. And you have, over the 10, 12 years, I have seen some of the key industries. You had system, each time there's a political change, there is the institution heads change. So there is no succession in the policy, and it's so ad hoc. Unraveling that and getting the fundamentals going on those will be very tough for us, purely because politics has got into economics over time. How do you unravel that? And that's a key part of, and your question was whether can this strategy of economic reforms without political reform work? I think if you really don't want this cycle to happen again, it won't work. You need to have both in tandem.
Thank you.
If I could just compliment that, I fully agree. But you asked the question, Paige, about whether we need political reform. And we have to be very careful what we mean by that, because we can think of changing the electoral rules, changing the parliamentary system, and things like that. That's not going to make any difference. I think there's too much of this tendency in Sri Lanka, and I see this on the economic policy side, to think of economic policy as a technical problem. All you do is just hire a bunch of experts like me and put them in a room and tell them to come out with a policy. That is precisely the problem with Sri Lanka, right? They don't think that you maybe should consult the people about economic policy. It's amazing. For 70 years, the economic policy has been dominated by the elites, without any sense of consulting the public. And somehow they're complacent in the fact that they have the elections every 5 years to think, okay, so that's the accountability. No, the main accountability is what happens between those two elections. And that's where they have failed.
Yeah, thank you. Let me move on to a question that I think maybe is dear to my own heart, given my own work in Sri Lanka, which focused on the civil war and the national question. There was a moment in the Argala when it seemed that the economic and class concerns could really overcome the ethnic divisions that have bedeviled Sri Lanka for a long time. But my understanding is that the protests didn't catch on as much in the north and the east and the Tamil regions, Tamil majority regions in the country, and some disappointment among Tamils, not clear to me how widespread, but at least among Tamil civil society activists, that the protests, while they were calling for accountability, as has been mentioned, they weren't calling for accountability around the issues of disappeared, that had been close to the hearts of many Tamils. And so, and maybe especially with the Rajapaksas physically back in the country, I presume thinking about trying to come back to power, maybe not. And the sort of tendency to play to the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism on that side. And so there's sort of incentives for both sides to play the nationalism card. And I guess my question is, should we be worried that in this moment of a political and economic turmoil, that not just the class and economic unrest that we have already been talking about, but whether ethnic unrest could also emerge, and how does that complicate the issues of economic and political reform that are needed? And Sarah, I was thinking about this question for you, but anyone else is willing to chime in, or is welcome to chime in as well.
Well, shall I go ahead? I mean,
yes, please go ahead, Sarah.
In the 2015 general election, that was when Mahinda Rajapaksa, after he was defeated in his bid for the presidency for the third time, the main issue was accountability. In the north and east, it was accountability with regard to the allegations of war crimes and the crimes against humanity. And in the south, it was accountability for the money that allegedly was stolen by the family. Now, we got something as far as the war crimes and all of that was concerned. We got some mechanisms. They have their problems, but nevertheless, we did get something there. Now, what's happened is that the whole issue of the economic crimes, as it were, has come to the fore. And as far as the North and East is concerned, they didn't feel that the South, where the major Aragalia was taking place, had taken their concerns into sufficient account. And they felt too, I think, that, look, standing in queues for petrol, all of that, we didn't have to stand in queues, we didn't have petrol. We ran our cars on kerosene oil, for 30 years. So, what do you expect from us in terms of sympathy or anything like that? So there is that divide. The president now has talked about meeting all the Tamil parties and trying to come to a political settlement of the ethnic question. But as I said to you earlier, I mean, he doesn't have really a mandate to change the structure of the state, which is what the Tamils are asking for. They're asking for a system of federalism. I don't think he has the mandate to do that, certainly not. And all he can do is to fully implement the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was brought in 1987 or 88, whereby he still has to, we don't have it fully implemented. We have to implement giving police powers to the provinces and giving land powers to the provinces. But one other point that I think needs to be noted is that we haven't had provincial council elections for 4 to 5 years. So there are provincial council elections, local government elections, general election, presidential election. All of these elections are sort of hanging fire in the sense of they are required, I think, to sort of provide a means by which the system can be sort of ventilated, where you can put out steam, and also whereby you can renew a mandate.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to chime in on that before we move to the geopolitics? Yes, Sonali, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I completely, just to emphasize what Sarah said, in terms of economic deprivation, the North and the East has been lagging, it's been now, more than a decade since the end of the war even, and has been historically lagging the rest of the country. And so this level of deprivation, if you talk about poverty rates, again, if you see the overall rate in Sri Lanka right now is 25%, in the northern districts, it's about 60% and has been. So you've had this extreme, it's in 57% in Vaunia. So you've had Kilinochi. So you've had extreme poverty in these regions well before the Aragale. So you can see why it doesn't catch on in the same way, because, there has been, severe lack of human development, severe income poverty, and so on. So again, in terms of, how do we distribute the pain, or how do we go forward, I think really regional policy has to be, into provincial councils, whatever, but really, when you think of macro policy, I think, there should be an element of regional redistribution thought about as well, quite carefully into this.
Thank you. Go ahead, Shanta.
Let me add something that may not be politically correct, but there's one aspect of the ethnic problem or ethnic issue that is actually creating problems for me, which is the Tamil diaspora, of whom I am a member, and Michael, I guess, and others have been working correctly for a long time to address some of these human rights abuses and the accountability. And they see that I'm involved in the negotiations over the IMF program. And so they come to me and say, why don't you put in a clause in a condition in the IMF program that the government should release the political prisoners, or, the disappear, give the information about the disappeared. Now, the trouble is, that's not the thing that the IMF could ever put in a condition. It's not even in the rules, and I tell them this, but they somehow don't want to hear it. So they come back and keep coming back. And the real danger is that this could only delay the IMF program. You'll still end up with the same conditions as before. It'll just take 6 months longer. And so I really find that people are getting too excited about this IMF program. And I think I understand that the government's back is up against the wall. So why don't we get something out of that? But this is really the wrong field in which to play. You need to fight, and there's a legitimate grounds to fight the human rights battle in the UN Human Rights Council. But this is not the real business of the IMF.
Thanks. My next question actually touches on something that was also asked in the chat. So I'll sort of meld my question and the question that came from, sorry, let me see who it was, from Justice Paikiasothy, probably butchering her name. But this is turning us now to the geopolitical implications of this crisis. And let's start maybe with the relations between Sri Lanka and its largest and closest neighbor, India, and then we can touch on China and the rivalry between India and China, and then Sri Lanka's relations with Europe and the U.S. and the West. So, or we can talk about all of those kind of lumped together, but thinking about how this crisis changes the way in which Sri Lanka positions itself with India, with China, with the West, how the question that was asked in the chat is whether the rivalry between India and China will make the situation for Sri Lanka worse or possibly better, giving it the option of playing the two against each other. Shanta, let's start with you on this and move around.
I'm not sure I'm the best expert on this, but
Shanta, there's a bit of a delay when you start talking. We don't hear your first few words, so now we can hear
you. There's no question there is a rivalry between India and China. I just don't know whether it's to the benefit or to the detriment of Sri Lanka. What I do observe, though, is that India is the third largest creditor, official creditor to Sri Lanka. So it's China and then Japan and then India. But in some sense, India punches above its weight in the debt negotiations because of the feature of China. But I think that the principle has to be, and that in terms of capital flows, I'm not going to get into the geopolitics, but in terms of capital flows, the Sri Lankans have for too long used political alliances to determine whom they borrow from. And that, I think, has been a mistake. The Rajapaksa administration, the recent Gotabaya's administration, they turned down a $500 million grant from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the US, and they turned down a $1 billion loan from the Japanese at 0.1% interest. Think about that today with the interest rate, right? All because they thought those were too aligned with the West, and then it was all on human rights and everything else. Whereas and they got saddled with these huge Chinese debt at commercial interest rates. So my view is you can have whatever geopolitical discussions with the Chinese and the Indians. When it comes to borrowing, just go for the cheapest loan you can get and proceed with that principle.
Kasturi, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, so from a business perspective, I think, like Shanta said, China and India both are two of our largest creditors, and I'm curious to see how each one would watch the other and each one's terms and the implication on what will happen to our economy because of it. Because we have FTAs underpinning these two countries as well, or to be signed. But look, I'm not the expert on this, but for me, Sri Lanka is a small country. We have 20 million people. While we sit in a geopolitical kind of an advantageous spot, we're too small to be taking alliances and working with one or two countries. We should be, on a policy point of view, be open to work with all the countries, because we will only survive if we get our exports up. We will only survive if we get our FDIs in. And that doesn't necessarily come from just the countries we're friendly with. It'll come from the consumption markets. And we need to have foreign policy with that in place. And when you're this small, look at Singapore. They would have views, but they're okay with most of the countries. And when you're this small, I think we can't be going into friendly countries. Like Shanta says, we should be able to keep, like, as individuals, we have friends and you have business. Our business should be on the best commercial rate, which is needed for the business. I mean, if we run corporates this way, corporates will be collapsing overnight. So I think the simple fundamentals, and what I can't understand over years, how these fundamentals have been missed and how people can be easily influenced to stand up and shout for the wrong thing. Look at the Millennium, the MCC grant. I mean, the educated people were on the street. Where, Nepal eventually had the same narrative. I think it trickled from Sri Lanka to Nepal, and they were talking about this whole invasion, but thankfully they got around it. But Sri Lanka just let it go. So even if we are to, in the long term, people should be educated on what's right for the country. If that is lost, I guess, remember, every person has a vote. We'll be voting for the wrong thing. And where the system is, our country is going to struggle. And that's where the policies and all would be in the hands of the wrong people. So if I dove it down to a small company, Sri Lanka is the size of a company in the US. Can you just get the board to run it efficiently? That's it. And make them accountable. For that, you have agreements with the people. You have to have agreements and the best terms you need.
Sarah or Sonali, would either of you like to chime in on this topic?
Sonali, you want to go ahead?
Well, there was an article actually in the Financial Times this morning about India and China in terms of infrastructure investment, and that India now wanting to, become a bigger player and to kind of compete with China in terms of capital investment and so on. And, in this climate, I agree with Kasturi. It is to see going forward, in terms of, Sri Lanka desperately needs productive investment, needs FDI, but also needs productive investment, because our productivity lag is a huge problem. And actually, since 2009, in all sectors, I think productivity has fallen rather than, even stayed the same. So in that way, again, just purely in economics, not geopolitics, I think, there might be certain advantages, coming from India, but could come from somewhere else as well. So it doesn't have to be. But I think, the overarching, the aim should be productivity increase and outward orientation. Our economy desperately needs, we are such an inward-looking economy. And that is essentially to do with what Shanta said. We kind of think about it technically, but it's political economy that in the end influences how policy is implemented. And they're all deals, and any economic policy is a deal made by, various interest groups. And in Sri Lanka, it's been interest groups that have pushed for an extremely inward-looking development path or trajectory. So we've had this, anti-export bias. We've had a very inward-looking strategy. So in terms of, if you're going to switch that, it's in terms of our international foreign alliances or FDI or bilateral investment, it is that it should be geared to a target, not, as you say, to our friends. So development should be the overriding narrative, not friendship or advantage.
Sarah, you want to jump in on this?
I mean, China has become the issue that it has become currently in Sri Lanka for the simple reason that the Rajapaksas decided that they needed protection internationally against the allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And they also wanted money for their vanity projects and their infrastructure projects. And China provided both. However, the relationship with India is a very old one. It's in our DNA. It's a love-hate relationship. We can't get the Indians out of our system, And during the tenure of the Rajapaksas in power, they turned their backs on India effectively. But because of India's relationship with the Tamil community, it seemed to be the case that they had divided up Sri Lanka into north of Vavuniya. India got first refusal as far as development projects were concerned. South of Vavuniya, it was the Chinese. So they divided up the country in that respect. And as a consequence, we're paying the consequences of this kind of division. One other thing that must be said, though, is that I think the relationship has somewhat rectified, because in the period when we needed bridging finance, the Indians have given us something like $4 billion, whereas the Chinese have not been so forthcoming at all. And in that sense, I think Sri Lankans now may well come to realize that although they don't love the Indians, and there are all sorts of paranoia about the Indians coming and taking over the country and all of this kind of thing, that at the end of the day, it is India, if there's anyone, who won't let us go under. But at the end of the day, that is the salvation. And indeed, I mean, given that India has the pretensions of a great power within this region and all of that, it can't allow a major collapse of this kind. But I mean, going back to what Kasturi said, I mean, in the 1970s, when Mrs. Bandaranaike was the prime minister, we had a policy of non-alignment. And in the India-China war, we tried to mediate. In the India-Pakistan war, we allowed the Pakistanis to come and refuel. We can't afford to take sides. We have to be friends with all and maintain our independence right throughout.
Thanks. That actually gets to exactly what I was going to ask about whether it would be possible to have an economic policy that, takes loans or grants on the best terms and have that be completely separate from a political strategy of alliances or alignments, or whether those two things have to go together. And Sarah, you've answered that by saying, you have to be non-aligned politically so that you can manage your economy. I see other heads nodding, so I'll take it there's not debate on that on that point. Let me just check the Q&A and see how we're doing on questions. I want to remind folks in the audience to please put questions in the Q&A, and I can try to pull them in as I'm asking my questions, and then I'll also turn to them in a bit. So since we're on the questions of kind of foreign relations and geopolitical implications, let me turn, and since we're holding this at Columbia on Zoom, you can kind of pretend that you're not in any geographic space at all. But I want to talk a little bit about U.S. policy or lack of policy towards Sri Lanka. To my knowledge, the U.S. hasn't articulated a clear, certainly a very forceful policy on Sri Lanka during the crisis, or now it's kind of held back a bit. So I guess my question would be, what should U.S. policy be if you were advising the Biden administration on how to approach Sri Lanka? Is this kind of hands-off policy the right one? Would you advocate something else? Shanta, let's turn to you first on this.
All right, good. Yes, no, it's a very good question. I've struggled with it a lot in terms of the current crisis. The first thing is the U.S. is not in a position, the way the U.S. finances are structured, to give the kind of $4 billion loan that Sarah was talking about for this emergency. That's not, the U.S. doesn't have that capability. I mean, they have the resources, they just don't have the capability to transfer that kind of money in the short run to a middle income country. That said, the U.S. can actually play an enormous role. The U.S. could actually make sure that Sri Lanka gets $3 billion through its vote in the IMF. It is the largest shareholder at the IMF. And so if the U.S. plays a constructive role in terms of helping the IMF program go through, that's a huge contribution that the U.S. is making to Sri Lanka at this time. Now, but that does raise the issue because, as we know, the U.S. and China are engaged in a Cold War at the moment. And the danger is, and there's some evidence that it's actually playing out, is that that Cold War gets played out in Sri Lanka. And so what I tell, I mean, I meet with the State Department and various people in the U.S. government, and I tell them, even if you just say do no harm, just play your geopolitics somewhere else, but not in Sri Lanka at this time. And frankly, some of the Biden administration's statements have not been helpful. Samantha Power gave a speech talking about the China debt trap in Sri Lanka. And by the way, that's not true. As Sarah suggested, the reason Sri Lanka has all this debt to the Chinese is not because of the Chinese, it's because of Sri Lanka. And that was not helpful. Now I sort of shoot out my friends in the State Department who said, Shanta, I remember it's the midterm elections are coming up, and so they had to say these things. Now, midterm elections are over, and they turned out better than expected. So maybe we can tone down that rhetoric, but we have to be very careful because China is also watching the U.S. in terms of its debt, the debt restructuring in Sri Lanka. In fact, we're in this situation where the U.S. doesn't want to approve IMF money if it'll go to repay the Chinese. The Chinese don't want to give debt relief if it goes to repay U.S. banks. So, neither of this is going to happen, I assure you. We have put in place enough mechanisms for neither of these to happen, but the rhetoric is such that it could actually delay the situation. So the U.S. could play a very constructive role if they say, look, we're going to work to do what's best for Sri Lanka, and we'll fight our geopolitical battles on some other battlefield.
Sarah or Sonali, do you want to jump in on U.S. policy? And then I want to turn to Kasturi on U.S. privates, the U.S. private sector.
Yeah, what I would say is that the U.S. policy should be a lot less China obsessed. That far too China-centric, China obsessed. That is just extremely damaging at the end of the day, extremely damaging. Yeah. So if they move away from that and treat Sri Lanka as another country in the region, that'll be fine. And also they should keep up their comments and all of that in the Human Rights Council as one of the members of the core group that brought that resolution, and remind Sri Lanka about its international obligations in that respect.
So Nala, do you want to jump in? You're good. Okay. Okay, Kasturi, let's turn to you and ask, what in your opinion should the U.S. private sector do in this situation?
So I'll try to keep it to what Sri Lanka needs. I mean, they might as well do something we need or try to support us in. And today what we need is outward looking exports or trade and being productive. I think Sonali alluded to that. The only sector which is actually outward as well as globally competitive and productive is the apparel sector. The only reason is their customer is out, and they learned what best in class was because of partnerships. And today they kind of put benchmarks in terms of what best in class innovation is in the apparel vertical. Everything else has been protected. We've been in this little bubble of happy with the little we know. It's a deal so that you don't necessarily have to be competitive. And globally, you don't really know what best in class looks like. So how can US help? Look, we are not the best in formulation, product or service, right? But we could learn. Sri Lanka has the best people to learn. Transfer the knowledge, tell us what's needed, what is the consumer needing there, try to put in some, get Sri Lanka to produce it, whether it's, even if when I was listening to the North, yes, I'm a Tamil, and whenever I go to the North, I feel guilty have not done anything in the North, because economically it is worse than 30 years ago. And people just, some of the smartest people, they could benefit by setting up businesses there. A domestic business setting up there doesn't make sense. You need to be able to accelerate access to global market. So what we need access to market. And if the consumer is there and the consumption is there, can you set up this business here? Can you lift and shift some of the best in class practices and train them? Because that's what we don't know, because we've not been serving that much. We have not learned the technology on it or those formulations, whichever you talk about. If you put that as we want to do it just to get this economic going and get the market access, get some outward oriental trade plus productivity, the trickle down effect in the long term would be much great. So today we are a closed economy. I mean, we export just a few things and that's about it. But we have the capability, even though it's 20 million people, to learn and do it. And basically, recently I was talking to some US companies, and they have the best creative people, but technically Sri Lanka has some of the best operational people to solve problems. So I told them, you have the problem, I have people here who could solve it. But, it doesn't come naturally, because the world can't be all of creative people. You have those, can you connect the two markets?
Do you have a sense of beyond the apparel industry, what industries would sort of be the most likely to be the next kind of thing that could work well in Sri Lanka?
I think others can jump in, but low-hanging fruit where we evolve to a certain level is the tech industry, because it has already got some footing. But again, it's on competitiveness. It's also about the environment in how we operate, whether there has to be stability for them to trust and work with Sri Lankan companies here. So that is a big issue. And basically, though, what I feel we should do is we have some, I don't know, I play around with this world's best cinnamon. I play around with some of the unique tea stuff. Is there singularly things you could do on value add on that? The world is talking about stuff there, and we have got some of the natural resources which are consumed by those Western markets in the commodity form, or now, if you look at the trends, it's mostly on value-added formats, which means it's actually really beneficial if you get that recipe right. But we don't have the technology. What is Sri Lanka good at? Over years, we just do bulk sale. And that's been so marginalized. It's a dog-eat-dog business, and you really don't get anything out of it. Can you step it up into something else? I think those are important stuff where Sri Lanka has a unique competitive edge. Rest is, of course, the other service I think about is the accountants here. We've got one of the largest catchment areas of accountants. Can they do, do services from here? But mostly, I mean, that's top of my mind. But I think on an evolution of value addition, I guess you need to take something from here. The other aspect I feel is Sri Lanka is a market access to India. Sri Lanka is a market access to any country in the region where we have a strong FTA. Logistically, if you do position it here and use some of the strong FTAs we've got for the region, is there a way another country could set up a business here and a US company who serves one of those markets, but actually has a beneficial market access with one of our FTAs? I mean, there's a lot we should look at. If the intention is there, we could slice and dice it and see. It necessarily doesn't have to be a raw material from here or something unique. It's just maybe you put it here to connect the two, the manufacturing and consumption market. One thing we learned from COVID is disruption makes logistics a nightmare. Disruption, whether it's health or whether it's shipping or whether it's anything else. Even the commodity price hikes and lows, when you have a long logistics solution, it kind of makes it non-competitive. Shorter cycles, shorter lead times is easier. And for that, logistics is an important part. And even that. So there are quite a bit of areas you could look at, but the intention should be there. And you put some right people into a room and tell them, figure out the solution.
Well, while we're on I'm seeing people unmute themselves. Do people want to chime in on this? Yeah, go ahead, Shanta.
I fully agree with Kasturi about it's the IT sector broadly defined that has any real hope of being an export-driven country sector. The problem is we should be very careful because Sri Lanka has a declining labor force. The population is aging, as you might tell from some people on this call, the traditional idea of labor-intensive manufactured exports is no longer viable in Sri Lanka. So what you have is a very highly educated population, but will be doing things that aren't very labor-intensive. And we have to be thinking in those terms. So that's why, I don't know what you think, Kasturi, but the future of the garment industry too is limited in terms of manufacturing in Sri Lanka. I mean, I know that now you have factories in Bangladesh and Pakistan and wherever else. But the other side of that is something else Kasturi mentioned, which I want to caution a little bit, is learning about productivity or getting productive investments from India. Because first of all, productivity is no great shakes in India either. I've looked into that. But secondly, the problem is that India still has a large labor force. So their industry is geared towards geared towards labor-intensive manufacturing. So I think the analogy is going to be different in terms of learning from people with a shrinking but more educated labor force, which could be other countries like Singapore, Mauritius, and so on.
Thanks. Yeah, so Sonali, go ahead.
Sure. To add to that, Shanta's point, we also have an exodus of skilled labor right now, and a huge drain of brain drain going out, both unskilled labor as well as skilled labor. And and at the moment, fair enough, people are going because they need to earn a living, they need to live. So there is no, they have no choice. But then what do we do going forward developmentally if we are to kind of have a tech sector, digital freelancers? Even we had a nascent, I think, digital freelance sector, and a lot of these people are kind of moving their businesses to Dubai or things like that. So how do we retain labor? And I mean, that is going to be a big issue going forward. And I completely agree. We need to kind of plug into this global supply chain, because we've been stuck way too long on an apparel, two-sector export, concentrated exports, very vulnerable. And in sectors where the global demand is shrinking anyway. So it's not like we can produce more and more. We've had a weirdly, I'm very pro the GSP, but the GSP gives you a protected export market to some extent as well. So you've had this kind of strange kind of export sector, distorted and so on. And never broken out of it. But then we keep talking about needing to plug into global supply chains, but where, how do we do it? And, we can't have a Foxconn, we can't manufacture, iPhones 13, 14 like India does, because we lack the labor, I think, we just can't do that. So in that sense, but then what do we do about the lack of skilled labor with anyone with an education? And I think, Sarah, I just saw the CPA did a survey of, what people want and of people's, attitudes, young Arugale, as well as do you want to migrate or not? And 18 to 30 something age group, about 80% of them said they'd leave if they could. Now that is, our demographic, the only dividend little bit we have is there. And if they leave, I mean, it'll be all, countries stuck with, those who can't leave. And
yeah, thanks. So this connects to a question that somebody put in the chat about specifically on the issue of the brain drain and citizens migrating to other countries. The question is, how can Sri Lanka rebuild its economy in the long run if its best and brightest continue to leave the country? I don't know if anyone has a great answer for that. It's a hard question. Does anyone want to take a crack at answering on what Sri Lanka's policy should be on that front?
Yeah, I'll take a crack.
Go ahead, Shanta.
I should say that I always get attacked when I say this, but so let me say, first of all, I mean, the way to stop the brain drain is to fix the conditions in the country, which is what we're trying to do. The reason that people are leaving is because the economy is declining. So it's perfectly rational for them. And actually, I think it's the only way they can make a living, as somebody said. But lots of countries face this problem of lack of skilled labor. What they do is they import the skilled labor. Why can't Sri Lanka import qualified doctors or nurses or engineers from Bangladesh? They got lots of them there, right? So what I find is very interesting, and that's why I say I get attacked, and I probably will by my colleague fellow panelists today when I say this, because but let me just preface that by saying many of the people who object to this are themselves former migrant workers in the Middle East or the Gulf or England or everywhere else. So they thought it was no problem for them to go work somewhere else, but God forbid one of those people comes and works here. So it's a really false mentality. It's really this closed economy mentality that somebody alluded to earlier, that, oh, we can't have non-Sri Lankans doing jobs that Sri Lankans can do. Well, if there aren't any Sri Lankans to do it, that's the only way. And that's how most of the Gulf states operate. That's how even countries like Maldives and others operate in Asia. I think we should be seriously thinking about importing labor in the current situation.
Go ahead, Tanai.
Yeah, but Shanta, how do we do that given wages? I mean, the reason people leave is because, there's a huge wage gap between what they're paid in Sri Lanka. A chef in a small hotel is going to leave and work on a cruise ship because they are paid 4 times as much. And so it destroys their family life. They go away for 8 months and so on. So the problem is we have this huge wage differential that we can't, at the moment at least, we can't compete. And even countries like Bangladesh, now you have the UK, for instance, poaching all the doctors, and it's not even poaching, it's demand and supply. It's
no,
wage
I assure you, it's not just Bangladesh, but what about Kenya or Tanzania? I can find you, I'm sure I can find you chefs in Tanzania. I know some of them myself who will be willing to work in Sri Lanka. They'd love to come work in Sri Lanka at the current wages.
Yeah. But
the question is, are the Sri Lankans willing to accept Black people? That's
Shanta, so I kind of also have a question like Sonali.
See, I told you.
Currently we've got contraction. Market has contracted between 20 to 30%, right? Consumption is down. And I must say, as private sector, we are seeing a flight of talent moving out. So we pay at parity to try and keep them. Two things. One is they're looking at earnings. The other is they don't have hope for their future. And anybody between 25 to 40 wonders how they would ever own a house. How would they ever own a car? And the fundamentals of not having a roof and transport and aspirations of a decent life is lost. They would go out. So how do we give that to them? In a contracting market where interest rates are high, where taxes are high, where employees' taxes have doubled, which I'm not saying is wrong, but it's only, I mean, we have lots of expenditure side reforms which are needed. It's a tough thing to crack without cracking the whole thing. I mean, it's tough to retain them. I think even if you bringing expats might be the short-term solution, because for them, they in their own country, domicile country, they must be having the assets and they have their own security. But long-term, we need to solve this. I mean, we need to be able to get our Sri Lankans should be able to uplift their lives living in Sri Lanka, not going to another country and living better.
No, actually, I would say it's I was making the opposite point, that this is not a short-term solution. This is because I think the question from the chat was, what is the long-term development strategy for Sri Lanka? So that's what I'm saying. This is not going to solve the current debt problem at all, right? So let's make that clear. This is the long term. Now, in terms of the long term of Sri Lankans being able to earn enough to build a house and enjoy a future life, the overwhelming evidence around the world, developed and developing countries, is that migrants are complementary with local labor. So this is how Sri Lankans will be able to afford a house, is to import the labor, because they're complements. I mean, look at Malaysia, for instance. Malaysia had all these Filipinos come in, and they worked as maids or babysitters and things like that, which enabled Malaysian, wealthier Malaysian women to go to work. The female labor force participation shot up in Malaysia, and Malaysia is a booming economy. So this is exactly what we need to do. Just like, I mean, you were saying earlier, we had to be a more open economy, import more goods. You also need to import more labor in order for your economy to grow and to increase productivity.
No, I agree. I mean, we can benefit it by in the pharma industry on our manufacturing. You need to get permission each time you need a specialist brought in. And the impact the specialist has on the rest of the team is so immense. I get it, but yeah. But that doesn't solve our brain going out. It's too.
No. Well, not in the short run, but in the long run, it will, in the sense that conditions in the country would have improved to the point where they don't have to go out to earn a living.
Let me ask, since we're on the topic of the economy and what the strategy should be, what you think the role of the tourist industry should be in Sri Lanka. Has Sri Lanka relied too much on the tourist industry, or is this an industry that can help get Sri Lanka out of the current hole? It's obviously been a very volatile industry, even before COVID, right, with the Easter attack. On the other hand, the tourist industry was developed while there was a civil war in Sri Lanka, which is kind of unusual. So I'm curious what you think the prospects are for the tourist industry as a help or a hindrance to Sri Lankan economy.
Only thing I would say is, as a principle, I think the tourist industry is fine, and it's very valuable, and they've actually managed it quite well. As you said, during the Civil War, it continued. You do get these shocks from time to time, but they've managed to diversify their sources of tourists and things like that to work around that. The one thing I worry about for any industry in Sri Lanka, I think Kasturi was alluding to this earlier, is you don't want to get the government's hands on it. And that's the problem. I mean, the tourist industry per se is booming. The government gets no revenue, fiscal revenue from the tourist industry, because all of these hotels have tax holidays. So we have to stop making this a freebie and start collecting tax revenues. I mean, I think it's, right now with this restructuring program, we're asking Sri Lankans to pay very high taxes. And all of these rich hotel owners are getting away paying zero taxes. There's something wrong there. So, let's make sure that the tourist industry is properly taxed and the regulations are such, and you should have some regulations, ecotourism and all of that stuff. But, please don't let the government try to use it as a source of, how shall I call it, rent seeking, by giving tax holidays to their friends to come and have a hotel there.
Yeah, Kasturi, go ahead.
Added to Shanta's thing is, I think one thing which, I think tourism is one big element of us to unlock, but I agree 100%, not only that, but the other industries and individuals who do not pay tax have to start paying tax. And that's the only thing which will bring us, I mean, we all have to do our part in bringing the country back. However, on the tourism side, one element which had systemically had impact on the tourism is the currency of using an ethnic divide and using ethnic minority issues in political agendas. And over time, you've seen each time there is an election coming, there is a minority issue brought in, the divide. And that kind of division in a country, you wouldn't want tourists coming in. Tourists wouldn't want coming in. So that has to be, and we saw one thing what I liked seeing during the Aragalaya was that sense of unity. And I thought, if anything, we years people tore everybody apart. And for a change, when you stand together, it just warms your heart. But for how long before somebody just brings a red herring here and all of us run in different directions? I don't know, but I just hope that is fixed for us to rely on tourism as a sustained source of revenue.
Thanks. Let me go to a couple of the questions from the chat. So one of them, I think, relates to just what you were saying, Kasturi, and it's something we've touched on already, but so Betty Tasan says, my question is, do you really think that Sri Lanka can overcome this economic struggle by not solving the ethnic, in parentheses, Tamils problems? We've touched on that a little bit already, and Kasturi, you were already touching on that a bit, but I just wanted to voice that question if anyone wants to speak to that issue. Tough one.
No, I mean, that is the key question at the end of the day. A lot of things stem from our inability to accept that we are a very diverse country and that we have, it's a country made up of many peoples, and we have to found our country on unity of that, which encompasses the whole question of diversity. If we don't do that, we're always going to have this as a sword of Damocles hanging over our head.
Sorry, I'm looking at the chat, which means I can't look at you. Yeah, go ahead.
No, the only thing I would add to that is we don't have to think of this as separate. You either fix the economy or fix the ethnic problem. There are ways to actually do both. In particular, try to improve the economy of the North and the East. I mean, this is a lagging region if I've ever seen one. And there's a lot that can be done to boost that part of the country. And with economic growth, you're going to actually get an improvement in the relationship between the ethnic communities, in the ability of them to share in the national wealth.
I want to bring that back to something that Sarah said early on about the fact that the current government doesn't have the mandate to really solve at a political level the question of federalism. So do you think it's possible through economic development in the North and the East, or leave aside the question of federalism, but implement a development policy that would improve the economy in the North and the East? Would that be the way you would advocate moving, given the lack of a mandate at the moment? Or do you think that there might be support, given what Kasturi was just saying, and we talked about earlier, the sort of moment of unity during the Aragalaya, that maybe there is a moment in which political solution to the ethnic problem might be more politically palatable among the Sinhala majority than it had been in the past, say?
Well, I mean, my point is that, yes, there might be a greater willingness to consider the question, but to come up with a solution that goes beyond the established constitutional parameters is going to be problematic, because people will turn around and say, look, do you have a mandate to do this? And you really need to do this after you campaigned on this basis at a general election. But yes, you can have a federal system of government without using the word federalism. And the problem here is that in Sri Lanka, these terms do matter. Britain is a unitary state. But when you think of Scottish and Welsh devolution, they've gone quite far ahead. So both sides of the ethnic divide need.
Go ahead, Sonali. Yeah.
Completely. I mean, we talked about, equalizing and regional policy and the lagging North and the East, and to implement economic growth policies for these regions. I think, some devolved system of political power is absolutely necessary, call it federalism or not. I mean, it would work better. The more decentralized, economic decision-making is, information gathering, we talked about never asking the people what they want in terms of development. So having a federal system would allow these regions to participate more wholly in regional policy, in regional development. So I think both are necessary. Yes, you need, these lagging sectors these lagging regions to desperately improve, but you also need the devolution of political power in some form or the other. It would enable the delivery of economic policy in a way.
So there's a question, actually this gets back to Shanta's plan for bringing in labor and migrant workers. There's a question about what that would do to domestic politics. I'm not sure if that means electoral politics, whether migrants to Sri Lanka would have the vote or not. But the question is, how would Mr. Shanta convenience politicians to approval? So I think that means, how would that affect the domestic political and electoral prospects in Sri Lanka?
Not just in Sri Lanka. You need to do that in the United States too.
Oh, we don't have you yet. Oh, no, there you are.
Yeah, I said it's not just in Sri Lanka. You have to do that in the United States and Europe as well.
Yes.
No, I mean, this is just a universal myth that migrants are damaging to our local society and our economy. There's just isn't a shred of economic evidence in that effect. All the evidence you can find show that migrants are a net gain to the receiving country, let alone to the migrant himself or herself. So you're absolutely right that the politicians will say, oh no, we can't have Bangladeshi doctors doing the jobs that Sri Lankan doctors are doing. And I think it behooves all of us to say, look at the evidence. Here it is. We can actually show quite simply and quite convincingly that the Bangladeshi doctors are a complement to the Sri Lankan doctors. You're going to get the medical union or whatever is very powerful. So they're going to go on strike for sure.
Unto death. They strike unto death.
Yeah. Strike unto death. Right? But the rest of us, the patients, the people who could actually get better health care as a result of that, should also go out in the street because they are the beneficiaries, potential beneficiaries. So we have to manage that, just like with any other misleading policy stance. But I think on the other question about domestic politics, I mean, if it's a question of votes, there's no presumption that the migrants will vote. I mean, that's not been the case in any of these countries. And you could even think of it as a circular migration process. People come for 5 years and then go back, which is the way they run it in so many other countries, Turkey and Malaysia and Jordan and so on. You could you don't have to sort of go the Qatar route of 3 generations living in the country with no voting rights.
On the other
You know,
hand,
We've had
Yeah, go ahead.
Chinese migrants, right? Working.
Oh, sure. Yeah, in the
working
plantations. Yeah,
labor. Yeah. So.
sure.
You know, we have something like almost 1 million migrant workers out in the Middle East and wherever else.
That's
They
right.
don't have a vote.
I know.
Sri Lanka.
Right.
on the other hand, the government that allows migrant workers into Sri Lanka might be able to expect the votes of those migrant workers if they were given the vote, right? So it's not clear that the political incentive is to keep people out, right? Yeah, interesting dynamics that Shanta, as you say, are not unique to Sri Lanka in any way. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go sort of skip around here for the questions on the chat, but the question about where was it about what are the chances of the Rajapaksa family coming back to power? So this was sort of framed in terms of people in Sri Lanka believe in conspiracy and manipulation of politicians. So what do you think the chances are of the Rajapaksa family winning the election back in the future? And look into your crystal balls and tell us what you think the chances are there.
Well, I mean, if Bong Marcos managed to come back into power in the Philippines, there's no reason why the Rajapaksas can't. But if the question is in terms of will it happen in the near future, I don't think so. But, I think the Rajapaksas probably still have a hold on between 5 to 10% of the Sri Lankan electorate. And so they will win seats, but they won't win enough seats to form a government or win a presidential election. I don't think so.
Dissenting views on that? All right, consensus on that point. Let's see. I'm not sure I understand this question. Somebody wrote Sri Lankan people's understanding of democracy versus the regime and a disadvantage towards communism or the regime. I'm not sure I understand that question, but I think it's maybe having to do with democracy versus communism. Maybe this gets to the kind of point about the narrative, the current narrative about those who are still protesting being, quite radical and sort of akin to the JVP. If anyone wants to chime in on that, it's not quite a question. Let's see, or if the person who put that in the chat wants to clarify what they're asking there, I'd be happy to bring that back up again. Then there's a question, I recently visited Sri Lanka last month. A common view that came up with Sri Lankans I spoke to was that they did not perceive the politicians had a credible plan to restore and stabilize the economy. How can the government instill confidence in their plans, particularly when it will involve some painful reforms? And I think you touched on this a bit, Sarah, in terms of the lack of mandate given the painful reforms needed. But I guess if you were advising the current government on how to try to get these economic reforms through, given the lack of legitimacy, is there a way to thread that needle?
Well, I mean, there is no escaping from a cogent, credible communication strategy of what the economic policy entails, why we have to do it, where is it heading to. That conversation needs to happen, and it's not happening as far as I see. You have to win the people's confidence. And the only way of doing that is by going out and speaking to them.
The one thing I would add is that the government should also undertake some actions that credibly signal it is serious about improving governance. Sarah started by saying the problem is governance, which is absolutely right. So for instance, I mean, since I am advising them, I've been pushing this, not getting very far, which is the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. If this government could say, we're going to recover the stolen assets from the previous administration. And by the way, this was already underway in 2015, or the Ahapalania government era, but then it stopped halfway when Gotabaya won the election. So we could just start it up again. But that would be a credible signal not just to the Sri Lankans, but to the rest of the world, that this is going to be a shift. Otherwise, it's just the same. It's just the same group of rent seekers from the old regime who are sitting around, and we're not going to see much progress.
But the problem, Shanta, is that he will have to investigate the supporters of his government at the moment.
Yes, I know. So that's the, if they can. Absolutely. But that's why it's a credible signal, if they can do that.
Is that politically possible?
Well, does he want to? I mean, does he want to give a credible signal of that sort, or does he want to stay in power in this way? I mean, the question is,
I think that's
what's in it for him to give a credible signal.
But I think what Sarah was alluding to was that he won't stay in power unless he does something like this. If he continues the current system, he doesn't have any legitimacy and he'll lose the election.
Oh, yeah, he'll lose the election. I meant staying in power even now.
Oh, until the election.
So he faces either a no confidence vote in the short term or losing the election in the medium term.
Well, I mean, assume that he goes against the members of the Sri Lanka Podujana Perumal, the SLPP, the party that now supports his government. Let's assume that he goes against them. Let's assume that they turn around and tell him, look, if you proceed with this further, we're going to bring a vote of no confidence and we're going to dissolve this government, right? So then where does he go? All he has is the armed forces. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why he has relied on the armed forces and given in to the armed forces to do the human rights stuff, all of that, because he has the armed forces to watch his back. He can't trust implicitly any members of parliament, except for one, the person who succeeded him in terms of taking his seat. So I think that's a problem that he has. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think when you talk about governance, there has to be a sign of accountability, and that has to trickle down at every level. So at the moment, it's like, yeah, we are not going to be accountable. We'll do what we want because there's no signal of governance in place. And that's a serious concern is from a citizen's point of view. And when you do business, it is a concern. And when Sarah said about the safety of people and the powers vested, who protects the people for the right thing? I mean, and that signal is another thing I would like to see changed.
Thanks. It's political rock in a hard place, for sure. Let me turn to the question about whether this crisis is kind of the shape of things to come for lots of other countries. The argument has been made that Sri Lanka is the proverbial canary in the coal mine, and while this is the first country to kind of face this sort of upheaval from a debt crisis, it won't be the last. So the question is whether this is a kind of a uniquely Sri Lankan problem, or whether this is, with different permutations in different countries, something that we'll see elsewhere. And Shanta, I know you've written on this, so maybe I'll start with you and get your take on that, and then turn to Sonali and others.
There's no question that there are a significant number of countries that are facing debt crises. I mean, there's something like 25 of them that are in what the IMF calls extreme risk of debt distress, or something like that, which is like really bad from IMF speak. And Sri Lanka is one of them. Now, I think that there's a difference, which is what I'm finding is that most of these countries don't wait till they run out of reserves to start the discussion with the IMF and start the debt restructuring. Bangladesh, which has a debt to GDP ratio of 40% or something, has already started an IMF program. That's exactly what Sri Lanka should have done 2 years ago. So the situation is acute in a country like Sri Lanka, but there'll be other debt restructurings to come. I'm almost sure. In fact, I'm getting calls from some of my friends from, I won't mention which countries because that gives it away, but they all want to know, what we're doing in Sri Lanka so they can learn from it. Because it's coming down the road. There's no question. We're in a serious global recession, and high inflation, energy prices, and everything else. So this is definitely bad news for the highly indebted countries.
Well, let me ask then, Shanta and others, without telling us what countries need to learn lessons from this, what should be the lessons? So if this is coming down the road, what lessons can others learn from Sri Lanka? The one you just mentioned about tackling this a little bit earlier, it's clear. Are there other, if it does turn into the kind of not just economic, but political upheaval and crisis that we've seen in Sri Lanka, what lessons from Sri Lanka, either things that have been done well or things that have been done poorly in Sri Lanka to learn from?
I would just add two more on that score. In addition to starting early before it gets too late, the other is actually something we discussed in this panel just a half an hour ago, which is don't use politics to determine your borrowing strategy. That again, Sri Lanka has done it. Has violated that big time, but there are some other countries, and we know the countries: Ghana, Egypt, Tunisia. These are the ones that are facing this situation right now. Now, a third, which is we said this in that article you mentioned in Foreign Affairs. If there are enough of these countries, see, right now the situation is, the IMF and the creditor community deals with each country individually. So they're working on Sri Lanka's debt restructuring, and then Suriname is a different department that works on that. But there might be something to be said for a collective response, that the global community gets together, just as they did with the HIPC initiative back in 2000, and to some extent in the Asian financial crisis. In the late 1990s, and certainly in the global financial crisis, but it was the developed countries that were in trouble. That a collective response can be better for the debtor than having to negotiate individual deals. So we might want to start thinking about that. Using the Sri Lankan case as you said, the canary in the coal mine, or I think we called it the harbinger, to say, let's start putting together that collective effort so that we don't deal with these individually as they come on stream.
I wonder if there might also be a way to connect this to some of the issues that came in the most recent COP meeting on climate change, and thinking about debt restructuring in relation to climate policy. And that would seem to me particularly ripe for thinking about this, not country by country, but thinking in a more holistic way, or more global way.
Yeah. And the idea of debt for nature swaps has been raised in Sri Lanka, among other places.
Right, because this crisis is not the only crisis in the world. The climate crisis is.
If there's another lesson anybody else could learn is, I think you cannot just give subsidies just to be popular. You should give, I know there are vulnerable communities, but that should be targeted. So as a country, we've been subsidized on power, fuel, and the biggest consumers are the people who can afford it. And the person who couldn't afford it actually didn't get it. So that is one lesson I think people should, any other country should learn. Is if there are vulnerable communities, that has to be targeted subsidies of a mechanism which has to be independent of a general kind of process. And not unique to Sri Lanka, but the bloated public sector or inefficient public sector is something you cannot ignore, because In our country, it has been ignored, and it has also been used as a tool to give employment when you are anyway inefficient. And these kind of unraveling these and restructuring this is going to be a real tough ask, because not only for the political fallout, but just particularly because where do these people work? What do they do beyond that? I mean, it has been just created to such a monstrosity, and I guess that's another lesson learned.
And I could add to that is that, think really seriously about revenue. I mean, that's the other side Sri Lanka just did not do historically, and also in the immediate term, revenue, which is so important. And, not only did we cut taxes, but we didn't look at other areas, FDI, foreign investment, there's no taxation there. I mean, revenue, one, we need to scale back expenditure, and lots of countries do, but revenue, I mean, that has to also be to think very carefully on how you raise revenue and to increase revenue raising if you're not going to fall into this twin deficit problem that we've always constantly had.
Yeah, point.
But the revenue, you're absolutely right about revenue. That's the one where Sri Lanka really is the outlier. It's the lowest revenue to GDP ratio in the world. But to Kasturi's point about the subsidies, unfortunately, other countries have been practicing the same thing, and it's much worse. I mean, in the Middle East, I did a study of the subsidies in the Middle East. I mean, it's of the order of 10% of GDP goes to energy subsidies, just fuel. There I was telling them, why can't you be more like Sri Lanka and try to reduce it down to 1% of GDP? Because this is killing them. So it's a good point. You're absolutely right, but the violations are legion.
I guess it depends on the country and how they can afford it, right, Shanta? When we can't afford it,
no, but it's more than it's hugely it's corrosive. It really does destroy the economy, because it's not just the money, but it actually changes relative prices. So people develop energy intensive industries because fuel is so cheap, and then these things pollute. They cause traffic congestion. We calculated the effect of fuel subsidy, gasoline subsidies on traffic congestion in Cairo. That's one city in Egypt. Was about 0.8% of GDP. The cost of that, just on the effect of traffic congestion.
Wow. Michael wanted to chime in with a question, so let me give the microphone to him.
Thank you, Professor Fortna. So I want to, I'm afraid this is not a question that would probably lead to a positive answer, but I wanted to sort of ask you all about this, the strength of Sri Lankan institutions. So, we talked about accountability being a problem. One of the features of the Sri Lankan democracy, however imperfect it is, I mean, we've always had elections that have overturned government and leaders. And then we talked about the legitimacy issue of the current administration that's in power. Are they elected? Do they represent the people? And then the governance challenges. And then this leads me to what Professor Saravanamuttu just talked about, a particular reliance on the military as an institution. So we are talking about how this situation will get worse over time before it gets better. We don't see the levels of institutional capability. So I wonder what you see as is there a threat of a military involvement, a high degree of military involvement? Is that in any way that you see as a problem going forward?
Well, I mean, during the Rajapaksa era, and particularly with the Gotabaya Rajapaksa presidency, the argument was that we really have military government without a military coup, because serving officers as well as former serving officers were in positions of authority all over the place. There were secretaries to ministries, there were heads of state organizations and all of that. I think in the Sri Lankan case, the way that they go is that the military may well be in charge of things, as they are effectively as far as the North is concerned, but they won't front it. They would get a civilian who is sympathetic towards them or who has been part of the military to be the president or the prime minister or whoever. So I don't think we will have the military formally, officially in government as such, but they are certainly a force to be reckoned with.
So I'm not seeing more questions in the chat. And we're close to out of time. I wonder if any of you would like just a minute or two for final wrap-up comments. I want to give you that opportunity if anyone has anything that you want to ask of each other. We've had a little bit of that already, but any closing comments that anyone would like to leave us with? If not, I just want to thank you all so much, to thank our audience, even though we can't see them. Thank you very much for tuning in to this webinar. And thank you so much to Michael for helping to make this happen, and to Olivia for making it happen behind the scenes. And then especially to our panelists for joining us on Zoom from all over the world to share with us your expertise about this very important topic. And as we've all said, there's lots to see where this goes in the coming months and years. So thank you very much.